Early in the course, we learned how to transform alkenes into alcohols and alkyl halides. And we're going to look now at other things we can use alkyl halides for. Probably their most useful application is in their conversion into so-called organometallic reagents. And these are simply compounds that contain carbon-metal bonds. The Probably the oldest and most versatile organometallic reagents that are used in the laboratory are so-called Grignard reagents, which are alkyl magnesium halides, and organolithium reagents. And as the name implies, these are alkyl lithiums. Both of these compounds, under the right conditions, can be formed from an alkyl halide and the corresponding metal in its zero oxidation state. So metallic magnesium and metallic lithium allow the formation of these reagents. And we're going to look at each of these in course. Probably the oldest and most important of these are so-called Grignard reagents. And Grignard reagents get their name from this guy. This is Victor Grignard, who, as a graduate student, was studying organozinc compounds and expanded that into the study of organomagnesium compounds. Ultimately, he won the Nobel Prize in 1912 for his development of these organomagnesium halide compounds and the reactions of those compounds. So let's look a little more closely at how one makes a Grignard reagent and the mechanism for their formation. So Grignard reagents are quite simply prepared by the reaction of an alkyl halide. So R is an alkyl group, and X could, in principle, be any of the halogens. In practice, it's typically everything except fluorine, and the reaction with magnesium in its zero oxidation state. So shown here are three pretty simple examples. The ether referred to in each case here is diethyl ether. And one of the most important aspects of this reaction is that it has to be carried out under scrupulously anhydrous conditions. No water can be present. It interferes with the reaction in a way that we'll talk about a little later. For all intents and purposes, the magnesium ends up inserted between the carbon and the halogen with these kind of covalent ionic bonds. There's a good bit of covalent character, but also a good bit of ionic character to these bonds. So methyl iodide, for instance, will react with magnesium, forms this compound known as methyl magnesium iodide. And you can see there's quite a range of things. Virtually any compound that has a halogen bonded to a carbon will react, and you end up forming the corresponding magnesium halide compound. So like all of these reactions that we introduce, we want to understand how this reaction happens from a mechanistic point of view, and we're going to look at that in detail. Organolithium compounds are similar to the organomagnesium compounds. Lithium, of course, is an alkali metal, not an alkaline earth metal, and that is what results in the slightly different stoichiometry. So if you look here, the stoichiometry is such that an alkyl lithium reacts with 2 moles of lithium to produce the organolithium compound, and there is a byproduct of a lithium halide salt. And again, you can see there's quite a range of compounds. Alkyl halides, vinyl halides, aryl halides will all react in a similar fashion to give the corresponding alkyl lithiums. You'll notice here there's a broader range of solvents in these examples. This is simply pure hexane, pure pentane, and again, ether refers to diethyl ether. And just like the Grignard reactions, it's important that these reactions happen under anhydrous conditions. The reagents themselves are highly carb anionic, meaning they are in many respects can be considered to be a resonance hybrid of the covalent carbon metal compound and the ionic carbon metal compound, with the ionic being the dominant resonance form. You want to think of these as carbon anions where there's a non-bonded pair of electrons on carbon and a metal counter ion. If you calculate the electron distribution and generate an electrostatic potential map for a simple compound like methyl lithium, you can see that it's showing this range of colors where positive is blue and negative is red. That's a very highly ionic compound. And so it's just simply a difference in electronegativity between these very low electronegativity metals and carbon. All of these organometallic reagents can be stabilized by solvents that interact with them quite strongly. We find, for instance, that Grignard reagents are often made in diethyl ether or some other kind of ether as the solvent. So here we've drawn out the structure of diethyl ether, and it's known that once the compound forms, here's in a generic sense, it's our alkyl magnesium halide, that these ethers can participate by a Lewis acid base interaction, donating electrons to the magnesium, and that stabilizes the complex. What's also known is, this is an oversimplification, that these compounds also exist in equilibrium with the magnesium halide and the dialkyl magnesium. While that's interesting, it's actually not fundamentally important to understanding how they react, so we're going to focus our attention on the structures of these compounds in that form. So now let's look at the mechanisms of these reactions and how they form. So we're going to push some electrons around. Oops. There we go. So we're going to begin with the organolithium reaction. It's mechanistically a little simpler than the magnesium one. And that reaction begins by a one electron reduction. The alkali metals are pretty powerful reducing agents, and lithium can donate one electron into the carbon halogen bond. It's actually donating that electron into the antibonding orbital, somewhat destabilizing the structure. Notice the arrow I drew has only half arrowhead, indicating the movement of a single electron. So what this generates is something that is difficult to draw from a Lewis structure point of view. And so what we can do is kind of indicate that we have an extra electron and thus a negative charge. So this is known as a radical anion. The other thing produced in this step is a lithium cation. That one electron reduction into the antibonding orbital destabilizes the compound sufficiently that it then undergoes a homolytic bond cleavage. So that's breaking of the carbon iodide bond with one electron going with each partner. So that produces an iodide ion and a carbon radical. So we have one electron. That's a neutral species. And that carbon radical can simply combine with another lithium atom, here with the lithium atom supplying one electron and the methyl radical supplying one electron, to produce the methyl lithium product. So again, walking through the mechanism, it's a one electron reduction of the carbon iodide bond, producing this thing we call a radical anion. We have a dot showing there's an odd electron and it has a full negative charge. That electron has been added into the antibonding orbital, and just thermal energy causes a homolytic bond cleavage, one electron going with iodine and it takes that other odd one, the other electron going to carbon, so iodine ends up as an iodide ion. You'll notice we have produced lithium iodide as our byproduct. And then the methyl radical combines with another lithium atom, which is also a radical species, in a bond-forming reaction. This is a homolytic bond formation. That was a homolytic bond cleavage, and we form methyl lithium. The mechanism for the reaction with magnesium is somewhat similar, and let's draw that one out. All right. So again, we're going to start with methyl iodide. And now our reducing agent is magnesium. But it's also a pretty good reducing agent. We'll donate an electron into the antibonding orbital of the carbon iodide sigma bond. This is going to produce a magnesium cation, which is a radical species, has an odd electron. And just like in the previous reaction, a radical anion out of the methyl iodide. Again, the electron goes in the antibonding orbital and destabilizes the species. So one electron goes with the carbon, one electron goes with the iodine along with the other odd electron. The result is we produce an iodide ion and a methyl radical. That methyl radical combines with the magnesium we produced earlier, the cation. Again, this is a homolytic bond formation. And that produces a magnesium alkyl radical. This thing will have a positive charge and will combine with the iodine. Essentially forms a salt. So we more commonly draw this as simply IMgCH3. We understand that the iodide magnesium is essentially an ionic bond. Organolithium and Grignard reagents are powerful tools in the laboratory, and there are many reactions you can do with them, and we will talk about many of those reactions down the road. But the first thing we want to talk about is one of their properties and one of their types of reactivity, which is that they are strongly Bronsted basic. They're some of the most powerful bases known. And in the presence of even weak acids, they will rapidly deprotonate those acids to form organic compounds of some sort. So you can see here's a just very simple example. Here's that methyl lithium that we drew the mechanism for its formation. In the presence of even a very weak acid, that carbanion, remember we think of these as ionic compounds, that carbanion will deprotonate that acid and very quickly form a new carbon-hydrogen bond. And so that would transform our reagent into an alkane. So you can see down below is a couple examples of that. Here's butyl lithium. Again, you want to think of these things as very strong bases. It would very easily deprotonate water and producing butane and lithium hydroxide as a product. Methyl magnesium iodide, which we just wrote the mechanism for, would react, for instance, with methylamine, which can be a proton donor. It's a very, very weak acid, but it's certainly a strong enough acid to react with methyl magnesium iodide, and that would produce methane and methyl iodohydroxide as a byproduct. Generally, these are reactions to avoid. If you went to the trouble of making butyl lithium, presumably you're not trying to make butane. If you went to the trouble of making methyl magnesium iodide, you're presumably not trying to make methane. You're going to use these reagents for some other purpose. So these are typically reactions one wants to avoid. So this explains earlier why I said these reactions have to be carried out under anhydrous conditions. Any water that might be present would immediately react with these compounds as soon as they were formed and turn them into the corresponding alkane compounds, which is often not what one wants to make. This example, you notice down here, where this is an amine, its pK is 36. So that is a stronger acid than this. So this equilibrium is going to form to the right. It always favors the weaker species. To put this in perspective, you can think of these organometallic reagents as being the conjugate bases of some sort of alkane. So for instance, that methyl lithium, which we drew the anion this way, can be thought of as the conjugate base of methane. Now, methane has a pK of 60. That's a very high number. That means methane is very non-acidic. Correspondingly, that means that its conjugate base is going to be powerfully basic. If you have a weak acid, its conjugate base is going to be a strong base. So if you have a very weak acid, such as this, then that means its conjugate base is going to be a very strong base. And so some of the strongest bases known are in fact these, because they are, for all intents and purposes, the conjugates of these corresponding alkanes. If we look further down the list, you can see carbon-hydrogen bonds of different organic compounds. Here we have vinyl compounds, aryl compounds, alkynyl compounds. And again, you can make organolithiums from alkyl halides that give rise to these anions. And you can see that these anions will correspondingly be less and less basic because the hydrocarbons over here are more and more acidic. Nevertheless, these are still quite strong bases. Now, it's hard to put these numbers in perspective, but here's some numbers to do that. Water is a good reference. Its pK is about 16. And you know that water can be both acid or base. Alcohols have about the same acidity as water. Thiols are slightly less acidic, or slightly more acidic. Carboxylic acids, you might judge by the name acid, are more acidic still. But none of these things fall into the category of these over here. Amines you can find over here. One application of this acid-base chemistry of organometallic compounds is creating isotopically labeled derivatives of organic compounds. And a few examples are shown here where we can synthesize a compound with a deuterium in place of a hydrogen somewhere in the molecule. So organic chemists refer to these as labeled compounds. Here, labeling meaning replacing an atom of an element with a different isotope of that element. So in this case, replacing hydrogen 1 with hydrogen 2, which is referred to as deuterium. Hydrogen is the only element on the periodic table that has symbols for its isotopes. D is the symbol we use for deuterium, which is hydrogen 2. And D2O, or heavy water, is available and can be used in the laboratory. For all intents and purposes, it acts like H2O, and so it undergoes the same acid-base chemistry. It looks, smells, tastes just like H2O. And so we can use that to react with an organometallic compound, and that acid-base reaction that is occurring will introduce a deuterium at the site where the metal is in the compound. And so if we look at our first example, we can synthesize ethyl magnesium bromide from ethyl bromide and magnesium in the usual fashion under anhydrous conditions. And then we can add not water, but D2O to that compound, and that acid-base reaction occurs, and we've introduced a deuterium into the molecule. So you can see two more examples, in this case you employing lithium compounds, and here we have vinyl bromide reacting with lithium to produce vinyl lithium. In the same way, the acid-base chemistry introduces a deuterium here now attached to our double bond. And finally down here we start with this chlorobenzene compound, transform it into phenyl lithium would be the name of this compound, and react reaction with D2O, we've introduced a deuterium, and so we have an isotope somewhere in the molecule. There are a variety of reasons why you would want to do this. You might be doing mechanistic studies or spectroscopy, and deuterium behaves and acts and has physical properties and magnetic properties that are different than that of hydrogen 1. Thiols are sulfur analogs of alcohols. Imagine just simply replacing the oxygen with sulfur. Um, Historically, these were called either thiols or mercaptans. This is an interesting name because it refers to the affinity of sulfur for mercury. Back in the 1800s, it was well known that sulfur compounds would react with mercury derivatives of different kinds. And so you sometimes refer to these. You'll see in old historical versions of references to sulfur compounds calling them mercaptans. IUPAC names these by in the fashion that you see here in bold. So you've got the alkyl group, and then you end that with thiol. So instead of methanol, it's methane thiol. Notice that you keep the E because of the TH that's inserted. So this is one butane thiol. And in this case, you need the one locant because the thiol group is attached to carbon number 1. If it were attached to the second carbon in, it would be a 2-butane thiol. Cyclohexane thiol by the same nomenclature, and this is known as benzene thiol. And in parentheses, you can see some of the older common nomenclature for these. One of the characteristics of thiols is they have nauseating smells. In fact, thiols are the kinds of compounds that are added to natural gas so you can detect it if there's a leak. There are sulfur derivatives of ethers known as thioethers, and there's a few examples shown here. They're also referred to as sulfides. They are named just like ethers are, but instead of ether at the end, we have sulfide at the end. So this is dimethyl sulfide. This is ethyl methyl sulfide, alphabetical order. Here we have a cyclopentyl group and a T-butyl group, so tert-butyl cyclopentyl sulfide. And unlike oxygen compounds, where an oxygen-oxygen bond is quite rare, sulfur-sulfur bonds are much more stable, and we find disulfides. This is something that also exists in biological systems, and so those are named the same way as sulfides, except that the ending is disulfide. Thiols are reactive in much the same way as alcohols, but they have pKa's that are lower. These are stronger acids. So for instance, a thiol will react with the conjugate base of an alcohol, that's an alkoxide, in an acid-base reaction that will essentially go to completion, producing a thiolate. Negatively charged sulfur is known as a thiolate ion, and the corresponding alcohol. And the reaction proceeds in that direction. You notice we're going from a stronger acid to a weaker acid in the form of an alcohol. The other name for these thiolates are mercaptide anions. Sulfur has some really unique reactivity that really sets it apart from its oxygen brethren. So one of the things that you can curiously do with thiol compounds and sulfide compounds is you can reductively remove the sulfur and replace that sulfur with hydrogen. So one of the common ways of doing this, which dates back to the early 1900s, is a reaction using a particular alloy of nickel, named after its inventor, known as rainy nickel. We don't need to go into the characteristics of that, but it's a solid, so this is a heterogeneous reaction. And you find various conditions for the reaction. Here we have rainy nickel using basic water. Here we have rainy nickel in ethanol solution. But the overall result is the same, and what isn't shown in the structures here is that thiol group is in fact replaced with a hydrogen. So there's a hydrogen that's introduced into these compounds in the position where the sulfur was. Overall, that's a net reduction, if you think of this as a redox process, and so we often refer to this as a Raney nickel reduction, and it essentially moves the sulfur. This is a very powerful tool in industry because sulfur containing organic compounds are often contaminants in things like petroleum and coal-derived materials because of the prevalence of sulfur in the Earth's crust. That sulfur is problematic because if you're going to use these things as fuels, when you combust them, that sulfur turns into sulfur oxides, and if those are released into the atmosphere, they can cause, they react with moisture in the atmosphere and they result in acidifying rainwater. And so a lot of organic substances that are going to ultimately be used as fuels are desulfurized using this sort of process on a very large scale. We talked about ethers earlier, but acyclic ethers. But ethers can also exist in a ring where oxygen is one or more of the atoms that make up a ring. And many of these substances are common laboratory solvents. Other of these substances are just very important from an industrial point of view. And here's a few examples of these. And let me highlight those that you should know these names of when we refer to them. Ethylene oxide is a very important industrial chemical. It's a starting material for making a wide range of commercial products, everything from adhesives to plastics to epoxies and those sorts of things. Tetrahydrofuran you should be familiar with, and you will see again and again, very common laboratory solvent. Tetrahydropyran has many uses in the synthetic lab. 1,4-dioxane is a common laboratory solvent. And so those are the most important of the compounds that you see listed here. Tetrahydrofuran gets its name from a parent compound. It's this one, known as furan. The tetrahydro refers to adding 4 hydrogen atoms and reducing those double bonds to single bonds. There's a few others on here that are kind of less important. Trimethylene oxide, you see here, another important industrial chemical. 1,3-dioxylane has some minor uses. And the 1,3,5-trioxane, curiously, is actually derived from formaldehyde, and it has a lot of laboratory uses. You can have multiple oxygens in a ring, and with these very large rings, you can get compounds that are known as crown ethers. The crown designation here refers to their three-dimensional structure. If you build a model of these compounds, they do have sort of a crown shape. They are not planar compounds. They have points like the tips around a crown, and those are the oxygen atoms. These are compounds that were invented and synthesized in the laboratory for a very particular use. And I'll show you an example of that here in a second. Before I do so, there's a simple nomenclature that goes with these. There's a number dash word crown and then another number. And if you look closely here, I think you can figure this out. 12 is the total number of atoms in the ring, and the 4 is the number of oxygen atoms. And the crowns are always made up by these 2 carbon connectors between the oxygens. So this compound is an 18-membered ring and has 6 oxygens spaced evenly around the ring. So these compounds were invented to solve a particular problem, and that particular problem was, how can you selectively remove one metal ion from a solution in the presence of another metal ion? So let's imagine that you had, say, an aqueous solution of salts that contain both lithium ions and potassium ions. The lithium +1 and potassium +1 ions are very, very similar to one another. They have very few different chemical properties, but one thing they do have, one difference between them is their overall size. And these crown ethers will coordinate in a Lewis acid base sense with these cations. The lone pairs of electrons on oxygen can act as Lewis bases, and metal ions in their cationic form are pretty strong Lewis acids. And these crown ethers, depending upon their size, can be quite selective for grabbing onto particular ions. So for instance, the 12 crown 4 was invented because a lithium ion will sit very nicely between those 4 oxygen atoms, and it will form a very tight complex such that that crown ether is basically going to hold on to that lithium and not let it go. The larger crown ether holds on to potassium, and there are other crown ethers that are designed to fit other metal ions quite strongly. There are even um, three-dimensional extensions of this idea where instead of just having a ring, you actually have a cage. And these cage compounds are collectively known as cryptands. There's kind of an interesting example of one shown here. Often these cryptands contain other atoms other than oxygen and carbon. Some cryptands contain sulfur. There are often nitrogen atoms that um, play the role of holding on to these chains that form the cage. And again, these are designed to grab a hold of and hold on to particular metal ions. And this particular cryptand, for instance, here, can coordinate to a metal ion of a particular size.